The air along the River Liffey carried the smell of wet grain and coal smoke. In a quiet corner of Dublin, in 1759, a neglected brewery stood half-forgotten behind heavy wooden gates. The building looked tired, its walls stained with years of failed ambition. Most men would have walked past it, but one man stopped. He studied the crumbling brewery carefully, as if he could see something invisible to everyone else. Not decay, but possibility. What followed was a decision so bold that historians would later struggle to believe it. He signed a 9,000-year lease, at a time when Ireland itself felt uncertain. Committing to 9 millennia of business sounded almost absurd. Yet the gamble would give birth to one of the most powerful brewing dynasties the world had ever seen. Years later, the brewery would echo with a truth that seemed almost prophetic. Fortune favors the bold, but fortune rarely arrives without its price. The empire that grew from those gates would bring immense wealth, global fame, and influence that stretched far beyond Ireland. Yet behind the black foam of the world's most famous stout would lie quieter stories of pressure, rivalry, and a family forever tied to the weight of its own success. Welcome to Dynasty Estates Chronicles, where we bring you fascinating stories of wealth, ambition, and rivalry from the world of the richest families in history. From grand estates to powerful dynasties, we uncover how fortunes were built and what they truly cost. If you love exploring the dramatic histories behind legendary empires and influential families, this channel is for you. If you enjoyed this story and want more riveting historical tales, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and click the bell icon so you never miss an update. Join us as we uncover the legacies that shaped the world of Dynasty Estates Chronicles. Long before the Black Stout became a symbol of Ireland, the story began in a quiet village surrounded by farmland and stone cottages. In 1725, in Selbridge County, a boy was born into a household where brewing was less a profession and more a daily rhythm of life. His name was Arthur Guinness, and though his family was not wealthy, the environment around him quietly shaped the path he would one day follow. Arthur's father, Richard Guinness, worked as a steward and brewer for Arthur Price, the Archbishop of Castile. In 18th century Ireland, such employment offered stability, but little chance for social advancement. Ireland itself was a land of contrasts. Wealth and power were concentrated among a small Protestant elite, while much of the population lived with economic uncertainty and political tension. Opportunities for ambitious young men were rare, and success often depended on bold decisions rather than comfortable circumstances. Yet inside the Guinness household, brewing was treated with seriousness and pride. Richard understood the craft well, and young Arthur watched closely as grain was malted, water heated, and barrels filled with careful precision. These early lessons were not simply technical skills. They taught patience, discipline, and a respect for quality that would later become the backbone of the Guinness name. History often remembers great empires beginning with grand resources. But the Guinness story began with something far smaller, a modest inheritance and a determined mind. In 1752, the Archbishop, who employed Arthur's father, passed away. In his will, he left £100 to Richard Guinness, and another £100 to Arthur. At the time, this was a meaningful sum, but hardly enough to guarantee wealth. For Arthur, however, the money represented something greater than its value. It represented independence. 3 years later, in 1755, Arthur took his first major step. At the age of 30, he opened a small brewery in the nearby town of Leix. The brewery produced ale, the popular drink of the period, and while the operation was modest, it marked the beginning of a journey that few could have imagined. In later years, the sentiment often associated with the spirit of the Guinness enterprise captured Arthur's mindset perfectly. Opportunities missed by most people because it is dressed in overalls and looks like work. At Leixlip, Arthur worked tirelessly. Brewing was physically demanding and financially uncertain, but the small brewery taught him something invaluable: how to run a business, how to maintain consistency, and how to build trust with customers. What no one around him yet realized was that this humble beginning was only the first chapter of a far greater ambition, one that would soon lead Arthur Guinness toward Dublin, a risky lease, and the foundations of an empire. By the late 1750s, the small brewery in Leixlip had begun to teach Arthur Guinness something every successful entrepreneur eventually learns: survival in business rarely comes from comfort. It comes from recognizing when it is time to move forward. Leixlip provided Arthur with experience, but it was a small town with limited opportunity. Dublin, by contrast, was rapidly becoming the commercial heart of Ireland. Merchants, traders, and craftsmen crowded its streets. Taverns filled with laborers, dock workers, and travelers arriving through the busy port along the River Liffey. Where people gathered, beer was always close behind. Arthur began to realize that if he wanted his brewery to grow beyond a modest local trade, he needed to be where the action was. So, in 1759, at the age of 34, Arthur Guinness made a decision that would later become legendary in the world of business. He moved his brewing ambitions to Dublin. There, he discovered an abandoned and struggling brewery at St. James's Gate. The property was hardly impressive. Its equipment was outdated, the buildings were worn, and the surrounding neighborhood was far from wealthy. Many investors would have dismissed the place as a failing venture. Arthur saw something different. On December 31st, 1759, he signed what may be one of the most extraordinary contracts in business history, a 9,000-year lease for the brewery. The agreement required an annual rent of £45, a sum that seemed manageable, but the length of the lease was astonishing. Historians have often paused at this moment, because it reflects an almost unbelievable level of confidence. In an era when most businesses struggled to survive a few decades, Arthur committed himself to nearly 9 millennia of brewing. A well-known saying often attributed to Benjamin Franklin captures the spirit of such boldness. Energy and persistence conquer all things. Arthur would soon prove the truth of that sentiment. At first, production focused mainly on ale, the most common beer of the time, but Arthur closely observed trends beyond Ireland. In London, a darker beer known as porter had begun to dominate taverns, named after the working-class porters who favored it. The drink was richer, stronger, and traveled well. A valuable trait for export, Arthur recognized an opportunity others had not yet fully embraced in Ireland. Throughout the 1760s and early 1770s, he gradually shifted the brewery's attention toward porter production. This was not a sudden transformation, but a careful and strategic evolution. Arthur believed in quality above speed. Each change was measured, tested, and refined before expanding production. The gamble paid off. By the late 1770s, Guinness Porter had begun appearing in taverns across Dublin. The distinctive dark beer was gaining a reputation for reliability and flavor, something tavern owners valued deeply. Consistency in brewing meant customers returned, and returning customers meant steady growth. Arthur also developed a leadership style that set the tone for the Guinness empire. Workers were expected to follow strict brewing standards, and the brewery itself operated with remarkable discipline. In an industry where shortcuts were common, Arthur insisted on quality control. This mindset reflected another historical truth that successful merchants had long understood. Quality is remembered long after the price is forgotten. Slowly but steadily, the brewery at St. James's Gate began transforming from a modest operation into something more powerful. Barrels of porter moved through Dublin's taverns and onto ships bound for other ports. Yet even as the business began to grow, Arthur remained focused on the future rather than the present. He was not building a brewery merely for profit. He was building something meant to last. And soon, a bold decision would reshape the entire identity of the Guinness brand. A decision that would turn a successful brewery into a dominant force in Ireland's brewing world. Success rarely arrives in a single moment. More often, it grows quietly, decision by decision, until one day the world realizes something extraordinary has taken shape. For Arthur Guinness, the brewery at St. James's Gate was beginning to reach that moment. Through the 1770s, the brewery steadily expanded. Dublin was a city alive with trade, and the demand for reliable beer continued to rise. Taverns depended on consistency. Customers expected flavor they could trust. Arthur understood this better than most brewers of his time. Instead of chasing rapid profits, he focused on discipline and scale. Large, copper brewing kettles were installed. Storage cellars were expanded. The flow of grain, hops, and water became a carefully organized system. Workers followed precise routines, and the brewery began operating with an efficiency that many competitors struggled to match. By 1778, Guinness Porter had become a familiar sight in taverns across Dublin. The dark beer, strong and full-bodied, was gaining a reputation among laborers and merchants alike. In a busy port city where ships carried goods across the Irish Sea, a durable beer was valuable. porter could survive longer journeys without losing its character. This advantage opened an important door. Exports slowly began moving beyond Dublin. Barrels of Guinness porter traveled to England, where the style had first become popular. Soon, ships carried the beer to other parts of the British Isles. The brewery that once struggled to attract attention was now part of a growing international trade. Arthur watched these developments carefully. He believed that a business should evolve with the market, but he also understood the danger of trying to produce too many products at once. The brewery was still making both ale and porter, but Arthur increasingly felt that one of them represented the future. The turning point arrived in 1799. That year, Arthur Guinness made one of the most decisive choices in the history of the brewery. He stopped producing ale entirely, focusing the company's full energy on porter and stout. For a brewer to abandon a traditional and widely consumed product was risky. Many brewers feared losing loyal customers if they narrowed their offerings. Arthur believed the opposite. Specialization would strengthen the brand. Instead of being one of many breweries producing similar ales, Guinness would become known for something distinctive. Historical brewing records from the period reflect the clarity of his decision. From this day forward, porter shall be our trade. The gamble worked. Concentrating on porter allowed the brewery to refine its methods and scale production more efficiently. The dark stout developed a flavor profile that customers quickly associated with quality and strength. In a crowded market, the Guinness name began to stand apart. By the mid-1780s, Guinness had become the largest brewery in Ireland. With success came influence. Wealth allowed the Guinness family to move gradually into more prominent social circles, though still primarily seen as industrial entrepreneurs rather than aristocrats. Their growing prosperity earned respect in Dublin's commercial world. Arthur himself, however, never behaved like a man chasing status. He was known for maintaining a disciplined routine and a careful approach to both business and family life. His marriage to Olivia Whitmore created a large household. The couple would eventually have 21 children, though many sadly died young, a common tragedy in the 18th century. The surviving sons began learning the business from an early age. Arthur understood that if the brewery were to survive beyond his lifetime, it would require capable hands ready to carry the work forward. Brewing knowledge, like family values, had to be passed from one generation to the next. Another dimension of the Guinness legacy was also beginning to emerge: philanthropy. Arthur believed successful businesses had responsibilities to the communities around them. While the large charitable projects associated with later generations had not yet appeared, the foundations of this philosophy were already forming. Workers at the brewery were treated with a degree of stability that was uncommon in many industrial workplaces of the era. A proverb often quoted in Irish culture reflects this balance between success and responsibility. Ni nud gocurle chele, there is no strength without unity. In many ways, this idea reflected Arthur's approach to building his enterprise. The brewery thrived not only because of his ambition, but because of the network of workers, merchants, and traders who supported its growth. Yet success also created new pressures. As wealth expanded, expectations grew. The Guinness name was no longer attached to a small local brewer. It was becoming a symbol of commercial power in Ireland. The family would soon find itself navigating a world where industry, politics, and social prestige were closely intertwined. Arthur Guinness did not live to see the full scale of the empire he had created. In 1803, at the age of 78, Apa said Hawaii. At the time of his death, the brewery at St. James's Gate was already thriving. Production was expanding, exports were growing, and the Guinness name carried increasing respect throughout Ireland. But the true transformation of the Guinness empire had only just begun. The next generations would inherit not only a successful brewery, but also the challenge of expanding it further into international markets, into elite society, and into a position of influence that would bring both admiration and rivalry. And with greater power would come something the founder himself had largely avoided: conflict. When Arthur Guinness died in 1803, the brewery he left behind was already one of the strongest commercial enterprises in Ireland. Yet success in business did not automatically translate into acceptance among the powerful social circles of the time. In the early 19th century, wealth alone was rarely enough to earn respect from the traditional elite. Ireland during this period was deeply shaped by social hierarchy. Landowning aristocrats held political influence and cultural prestige, while merchants and industrialists, no matter how successful, were often viewed as outsiders. Brewing, despite its profitability, was still considered a trade, and trade was not something the aristocracy easily admired. As the Guinness family continued expanding their brewery, they began encountering an invisible but powerful barrier: social legitimacy. The Guinness wealth was growing rapidly. Exports were increasing, production was expanding, and the brewery at St. James's Gate was becoming a dominant force in the Irish economy. Yet within elite society, the family remained something of an anomaly. Wealthy, but not aristocratic. Influential, but not fully accepted. This tension became particularly noticeable during the lifetime of Benjamin Lee Guinness, the grandson of Arthur Guinness, born in 1798. Benjamin would inherit not only the expanding brewery but also the complicated social position that came with it. Benjamin possessed many of the qualities that defined the Guinness family: discipline, ambition, and a strong sense of responsibility toward Ireland. Under his leadership, the brewery continued to grow in both scale and reputation. Yet he understood that business success alone would not secure the family's place among the most powerful figures of the era. Throughout Britain and Ireland, society still valued land, titles, and long-established lineage above commercial achievement. A wealthy brewer could command attention in the marketplace, but in aristocratic drawing rooms he was often treated with polite distance. Benjamin recognized this reality. Rather than confronting the prejudice directly, he began searching for ways to bridge the gap between industrial success and social respectability. One of his methods was philanthropy, the strategic use of wealth to contribute to public life and national heritage. This approach was not unusual among successful 19th-century industrialists. In fact, a famous sentiment attributed to Andrew Carnegie later captured the philosophy that Benjamin seemed to embrace decades earlier: the man who dies rich dies disgraced. For Benjamin Lee Guinness, wealth was not simply a sign of success. It was a tool that could reshape public perception. Still, the deeper conflict remained unresolved. The Guinness family was becoming enormously powerful through industry, but the social world they hoped to enter was built on traditions that valued inherited status over earned prosperity. The question now facing the Guinness dynasty was not whether they could build a financial empire. They already had. The real challenge was whether that empire would ever be accepted as equal to the old powers of society, or whether the Guinness name would forever remain caught between two worlds, admired for its success, yet never fully embraced by the elite it sought to join. As the 19th century progressed, the brewery at St. James's Gate continued its remarkable expansion under the leadership of Benjamin Lee Guinness. The company was transforming from a successful Irish enterprise into one of the most powerful brewing operations in the world. Yet with greater wealth came greater visibility. And visibility often invites scrutiny. By the 1840s and 1850s, Guinness Porter was being exported across the British Isles and beyond. The brewery had become a massive industrial operation, employing hundreds of workers and producing enormous quantities of stout each year. Dublin's docks were busy with ships carrying Guinness barrels to England, Scotland, and distant ports across the growing British Empire. In 1855, a milestone was reached that few Irish businesses had ever achieved. Guinness became the largest brewery in the world. This achievement brought admiration from merchants and laborers alike. For the working class, Guinness represented reliability and craftsmanship. For traders and distributors, it represented profit. But in the elegant halls of aristocratic society, reactions were more complicated. The British aristocracy had long measured status through land, titles, and centuries-old family lineage. Brewing, despite its profitability, was still seen as commercial trade. The success of the Guinness family therefore created a subtle but persistent tension between old wealth and new industry. Benjamin Lee Guinness understood this divide better than most. Rather than responding with confrontation, he chose a quieter strategy, one rooted in generosity and national pride. He believed that wealth, when used wisely, could reshape the reputation of an entire family. One of the most famous examples of this philosophy appeared during the 1860s, when Benjamin undertook an extraordinary act of philanthropy. St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin, one of Ireland's most important historical landmarks, had fallen into serious disrepair. The building, dating back to the 12th century, was in danger of decline. Benjamin Lee Guinness personally funded a massive restoration project, spending over £150,000, an enormous sum for the time. The project preserved the cathedral and restored it to its former grandeur. The gesture astonished many observers. It demonstrated that the Guinness fortune was not merely the product of commerce, but also a force capable of shaping national heritage. In later years, Benjamin's philosophy was often summarized in a sentiment that reflected his sense of responsibility. If fortune favors a man, he must return the favor to his country. Gradually, attitudes began to shift. Acts of philanthropy, combined with the undeniable economic importance of the brewery, made it increasingly difficult for society's elite to dismiss the Guinness family as mere businessmen. Yet the rising influence of the Guinness dynasty also created new pressures within the family itself. Success had elevated them into a world of expectations. Expectations of leadership, wealth, and social influence. The Guinness name was becoming a symbol not only of brewing excellence, but of Irish prestige. And prestige, history has often shown, is rarely achieved without rivalry. The next generation of the Guinness family would soon confront a new challenge, transforming immense industrial wealth into lasting social power. That transformation would bring them closer than ever to the aristocratic world that had once kept them at a distance. But it would also expose the family to new tensions, new responsibilities, and the growing weight of legacy. By the second half of the 19th century, the Guinness Brewery had grown into an industrial giant. What Arthur Guinness had begun as a determined experiment in Dublin had evolved into one of the most recognizable businesses in the world. Yet for the Guinness family, wealth alone was never the final goal. The next challenge was something far more complicated: social legitimacy. The figure who would carry the family through this transformation was Edward Cecil Guinness, the son of Benjamin Lee Guinness. Born in 1847, Edward inherited both the brewery and the difficult social position that accompanied it. By the time he took a leading role in the company, Guinness Stout was already a dominant force in global brewing. Production continued to expand, and exports traveled across Europe, Africa, and the growing network of British imperial trade routes. In 1868, after the death of his father, Edward took control of the brewery at the age of just 20. Many observers wondered whether someone so young could manage an enterprise of such enormous scale. Yet Edward quickly proved himself to be both disciplined and strategic. During the late 19th century, the Guinness Brewery experienced astonishing growth. Advances in industrial technology allowed the company to produce vast quantities of stout with remarkable consistency. Massive fermentation vats and improved transportation networks meant that Guinness could reach markets that earlier generations of brewers could only dream about. By the 1880s, the scale of the operation was extraordinary. The St. James's Gate Brewery employed thousands of workers and covered dozens of acres along the River Liffey. It had effectively become a city within a city, with its own workforce, logistics systems, and supply networks. But Edward Cecil Guinness was not interested only in expanding production. He understood that true power in 19th century society required recognition from the traditional elite. Wealth could open doors, but titles and land often determined whether those doors remained open. Edward therefore began transforming the public image of the Guinness family. One of the most important moments came in 1886, when Edward Cecil Guinness was granted the title Baron Ivigi by Queen Victoria. This event marked a dramatic shift in the family's social standing. For the first time, the Guinness name entered the British peerage, placing the brewing dynasty alongside the aristocratic families who had once viewed them as outsiders. For Edward, the title represented more than personal honor. It symbolized the moment when industrial success had finally forced the old aristocratic world to acknowledge the power of modern enterprise. Yet titles alone could not fully reshape perception. To reinforce their new position among the elite, the Guinness family began acquiring large estates and grand residencies. Edward purchased Dublin estate in Suffolk, a vast property that had once belonged to the powerful East India Company merchant, Prince Duleep Singh. The estate reflected not only wealth, but the lifestyle expected of Britain's upper classes: hunting grounds, impressive architecture, and expansive landholdings. In Dublin, the family also established Ivig House, a magnificent residence that would later become the headquarters of Ireland's Department of Foreign Affairs. These properties signaled that the Guinness family had moved far beyond the image of industrial brewers. They were now part of the establishment, yet the transformation was not without its complications. Despite the new title and growing social prestige, the Guinness identity remained deeply connected to Ireland. The brewery's success was built on Irish labor, Irish water, and Irish tradition. At the same time, the family's rising position within the British aristocracy created an unusual cultural balance. The Guinness dynasty existed between two identities. They were Irish industrial pioneers, yet they were also members of the British peerage. In a period when Ireland's political tensions with Britain were intensifying, this position sometimes placed the family in a delicate situation. They were admired for their success, but occasionally viewed with suspicion from both sides. Within the family itself, the pressures of wealth and expectation were also beginning to appear. The Guinness name had become enormous. Each generation inherited not only financial security, but also the responsibility of maintaining one of the most famous brands in the world. For younger heirs, this legacy could feel both empowering and overwhelming. A historical observation often attributed to John D. Rockefeller captures this burden well. "I believe the power to make money is a gift, but the responsibility to use it wisely is far greater." Edward Cecil Guinness seemed to understand this responsibility deeply. His philanthropy expanded dramatically during his lifetime. Among his many charitable contributions was the creation of the Guinness Trust in 1890, an organization dedicated to improving housing conditions for the poor in London and Dublin. The trust built thousands of affordable homes for working-class families, demonstrating that the Guinness fortune could influence society far beyond the brewing industry. These philanthropic efforts strengthened the family's reputation, reinforcing the idea that the Guinness empire was not only powerful but also socially responsible. Yet even as the family's public image reached new heights, the scale of the Guinness enterprise continued to grow. The brewery was no longer simply a business. It had become an institution, a symbol recognized across continents. And institutions, history, shows, rarely remain untouched by the forces of change. The Guinness family had achieved what earlier generations could hardly imagine. Wealth, aristocratic titles, international prestige, and cultural influence. But success of that magnitude carries a hidden risk. The larger the empire becomes, the more difficult it is to control. Soon, the Guinness name would face challenges that no amount of brewing skill or social status could easily prevent, challenges born not from outside rivalry, but from the modern world of corporate power and financial ambition. And when those pressures finally arrived, the dynasty would confront a moment that would change its history forever. By the late 20th century, the world that Arthur Guinness once knew had changed beyond recognition. The quiet brewery beside the River Liffey had grown into a multinational corporation, operating in dozens of countries and selling millions of barrels of stout each year. The Guinness name was no longer simply tied to a family business. It had become a global brand, traded on financial markets and watched closely by investors. With this new scale came a new kind of battlefield. Corporate finance. The 1980s were a dramatic era for global business. Across Britain and Europe, companies were merging, competing, and battling for control in what newspapers often called the age of the takeover. Large corporations sought to expand their power through acquisitions, believing that size and diversification would secure their future in an increasingly competitive market. Guinness was no exception. By the mid-1980s, the company had ambitions that extended far beyond brewing beer. Executives within the corporation began exploring ways to strengthen Guinness as a broader drinks empire, capable of competing with powerful international rivals. One opportunity soon emerged that seemed impossible to ignore. In 1986, Guinness sought to acquire Distillers Company Limited, one of Britain's most important spirits producers. Distillers owned famous brands such as Johnnie Walker Whiskey, Gordon's Gin, and Bailey's Irish Cream. Winning control of Distillers would dramatically expand Guinness's influence in the global alcohol market, but the opportunity came with fierce competition. Another company, Argyle Group, also launched a bid for Distillers. What followed was not merely a business negotiation. It became a corporate battle watched by newspapers, investors, and government regulators across Britain. For Guinness executives, the stakes were enormous. If they won the takeover, the company would transform into one of the most powerful drinks corporations in the world. If they lost, they risked appearing weak in a financial era where strength and dominance mattered more than ever. Behind closed doors, the leadership of Guinness prepared their strategy carefully. Financial advisors, lawyers, and corporate planners worked around the clock analyzing the situation. The takeover bid required enormous sums of money and careful coordination between investors. The atmosphere surrounding the company grew tense. Decisions were made quickly, and the pressure to succeed intensified with every passing week. A well-known observation attributed to Warren Buffett reflects the dangers of such high-stakes ambition. Risk comes from not knowing what you're doing. In the case of Guinness, however, the risk was not only financial, The battle for distillers would test the company's integrity, its leadership, and the reputation that generations of the Guinness family had spent centuries building. At first, the takeover appeared to be simply another aggressive corporate contest typical of the 1980s. But as the struggle escalated, decisions were made that would push the company far beyond ordinary competition. The stage had been set. Soon, the corporate battle for distillers would erupt into a confrontation that would shake the reputation of the Guinness empire and mark a point from which there would be no easy return. By 1986, the battle for Distillers Company Limited had turned into one of the most intense corporate struggles Britain had seen in decades. Newspapers followed every development. Investors watched the markets nervously, and within the executive offices of Guinness, the pressure to win had reached extraordinary levels. The takeover was no longer simply about acquiring another company. It had become a contest of prestige, power, and survival in the aggressive financial culture of the 1980s. Guinness's rival beater, Argyll Group, was determined to seize control of distillers. Their offer threatened to defeat Guinness, unless the brewing giant could persuade shareholders to support its own bid. In corporate takeovers, shareholder votes often decide the outcome, and every share represented influence. Inside Guinness headquarters, executives began crafting increasingly aggressive strategies to secure victory. At the center of the effort was Ernest Saunders, the dynamic chief executive of Guinness. Saunders was known for his ambition and confidence, qualities that initially appeared perfectly suited to the high-stakes takeover environment. He believed that acquiring distillers would transform Guinness into a dominant global drinks company. But as the contest intensified, the line between bold strategy and dangerous manipulation began to blur. To strengthen the takeover bid, certain executives secretly arranged a scheme designed to inflate the price of Guinness shares. By artificially boosting the company's share value, they hoped to create the impression that Guinness was financially stronger and therefore a more attractive option for distillers' shareholders. The plan involved covert agreements with investors who would purchase Guinness shares with financial support from the company itself. On the surface, the rising share price suggested confidence in the takeover. In reality, it was being carefully engineered behind the scenes. For a time, the strategy appeared to work. Guinness ultimately won the takeover battle, securing control of distillers and dramatically expanding its portfolio of drinks brands. On the surface, it seemed like a triumphant moment. The company had defeated its rival and emerged as a major force in the global alcohol industry. Yet beneath the celebration, the foundations of the victory were dangerously unstable. Investigators and financial regulators soon began examining unusual trading activities surrounding Guinness shares during the takeover period. The pattern raised serious questions about whether the share price had been manipulated. What at first appeared to be a brilliant corporate strategy was beginning to look like something far more troubling. A famous warning attributed to the ancient Greek historian Herodotus captures the lesson that history repeatedly teaches powerful empires. Great deeds are usually wrought at great risks. For Guinness, the risk was no longer theoretical. As the investigation deepened, evidence emerged that the share support scheme had violated financial regulations. The takeover that had been celebrated as a corporate victory was now turning into a scandal. Executives who had once been praised for their ambition were suddenly facing accusations of fraud and market manipulation. Courtrooms replaced boardrooms, and headlines that once admired Guinness's success now questioned its integrity. For a company whose reputation had been built over more than 2 centuries, the consequences were devastating. The Guinness empire had achieved its greatest corporate expansion, but it had done so at a cost that would soon shake the legacy of the entire dynasty. At first, the victory seemed complete. When Guinness successfully acquired Distillers Company Limited in 19, the company instantly became one of the most powerful drinks corporations in the world. The acquisition brought together an extraordinary portfolio of global brands. Alongside the famous Irish stout were now spirits recognized across continents. Johnnie Walker whiskey, Gordon's gin, and other celebrated labels. For a brief moment, it appeared as though Guinness had entered a new golden age. Financial analysts praised the boldness of the move. Business newspapers spoke of Guinness transforming from a traditional brewing company into a diversified international drinks empire. Executives celebrated what they believed was a masterstroke of corporate strategy. But history often reveals that the most dramatic victories can hide dangerous weaknesses. Within months of the takeover, financial regulators began examining unusual trading patterns connected to the Guinness bid. The rapid rise in the company's share price during the takeover battle had attracted attention from analysts, who suspected something was not quite right. Investigations soon uncovered evidence that confirmed those suspicions. The share support scheme arranged during the takeover had artificially inflated the price of Guinness shares. Certain investors had been secretly encouraged and financially supported to buy shares in order to maintain the appearance of strong market confidence. What had been presented publicly as enthusiasm from investors was, in part, carefully engineered manipulation. The revelations shocked the financial world. Guinness was not merely another corporation, it was one of Britain and Ireland's most respected companies, built upon more than 2 centuries of reputation. The idea that its leadership had engaged in such tactics felt like a betrayal of the values that had once defined the brand. A full legal investigation followed. The Guinness share trading scandal, as it quickly became known, moved from boardrooms into courtrooms. Prosecutors examined the actions of several senior executives who had participated in the takeover strategy. Among those charged was Ernest Saunders, the chief executive whose ambition had driven the takeover bid. Alongside him were other prominent financial figures involved in the scheme. In 1990, after a highly publicized trial, several of the executives were convicted of fraud and false accounting. Saunders himself was sentenced to prison, though he later served only part of his sentence due to health concerns. The scandal stunned the corporate world. For many observers, it marked a dramatic fall from grace for one of the most respected names in business. Guinness had once symbolized careful craftsmanship and long-term thinking. Now headlines associated the company with manipulation and legal controversy. A famous reflection, often attributed to the Roman philosopher Seneca, captures the fragile nature of reputation. It is a rough road that leads to the heights of greatness. The Guinness empire had climbed that road for more than 2 centuries. Now, in a matter of months, its reputation had been shaken by the actions of a handful of individuals. Inside the company, the consequences were immediate. Leadership structures were reorganized, and the era of strong family influence over the company's direction had effectively come to an end. Guinness was no longer guided primarily by descendants of its founder, but by corporate accountable to shareholders and financial markets. This shift marked a profound transformation in the identity of the company. For generations, Guinness had been associated with the legacy of Arthur Guinness, the determined brewer who had once signed that famous 9,000-year lease in Dublin. His story represented patience, craftsmanship, and steady growth. The brewery's reputation had been built slowly, one barrel at a time. The scandal of the 1980s seemed almost like a different world, one dominated by rapid financial maneuvers and aggressive corporate competition. Yet the company itself survived. Despite the damage to its reputation, the Guinness brand remained enormously strong. The stout continued to sell across the world, and the newly acquired spirits businesses expanded the company's global reach. Eventually, corporate restructuring would lead to another major transformation. In 1997, Guinness merged with Grand Metropolitan, forming a new global drinks company known as Dynasty. The merger created one of the largest beverage corporations on the planet, controlling many of the world's most famous alcohol brands. Within this vast organization, Guinness remained one of the flagship products, a symbol of heritage and tradition in a rapidly changing industry. But the merger also confirmed something that had already become clear. The Guinness empire, as a family dynasty, had reached its turning point. The company that once belonged to a brewing family had become part of a multinational corporation governed by modern financial structures. The descendants of Arthur Guinness were no longer the central figures shaping its destiny. The takeover battle of the 1980s had delivered extraordinary corporate expansion, yet it had also created a point of no return. From that moment onward, the Guinness name would continue to thrive as a brand, but the era of the Guinness family ruling the empire they had built was quietly coming to an end. The story that began with a brewer's gamble in 1759 had traveled through centuries of ambition, innovation, and growth. Now, it was entering its final chapter. By the closing years of the 20th century, the world surrounding the Guinness empire looked very different from the one Arthur Guinness had known when he first walked through the gates of St. James's Gate in 1759. What began as a determined brewer's venture had become part of a vast international corporate network. Yet beneath the modern structure, the weight of history still lingered. The Guinness scandal of the late 1980s had forced the company into a period of reflection. Corporate leadership understood that reputation, once set them ahead, requires time and careful action to rebuild. While the stout itself remained beloved around the world, the scandal had reminded the company that even centuries of success could be shaken by a single generation's mistakes. Internally, the company entered what many historians describe as a period of quiet rebuilding. Executives began emphasizing transparency, stronger financial oversight, and responsible corporate governance. The aggressive financial culture that had dominated the takeover era was gradually replaced with a more cautious approach. The goal was simple: restore confidence among investors, regulators, and the public. The transformation became clearer in 1997, when Guinness merged with Grand Metropolitan, forming the global beverage company. The merger reshaped the structure of the business completely. Instead of operating as an independent brewing empire, Guinness now existed as one of several major brands within a massive international portfolio. For some observers, this shift felt like the end of an era. The Guinness name had once represented a family-led dynasty, a business passed from father to son across generations. That tradition had already begun fading during the 20th century. But the formation of Diageo confirmed that the company's future would now be determined by corporate leadership rather than family inheritance. Yet even as control shifted, the identity of the Guinness brand remained remarkably resilient. The brewery at St. James's Gate continued operating, producing the iconic stout that millions of people associated with Irish culture. Visitors from around the world traveled to Dublin to see the brewery where the famous 9,000-year lease had been signed. The building itself had become almost legendary, a physical reminder of the ambition that had started it all. A historical observation often attributed to Winston Churchill captures the resilience of institutions shaped by time. Success is not final. Failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts. In many ways, this idea reflected the journey of the Guinness empire. The family dynasty that once guided the company had faded into the background, but the legacy of its founder, discipline, quality, and long-term vision continued to influence the brand's identity. The Guinness story was no longer being written primarily by one family, but the world they had helped shape was still very much alive. Even as the structure of the Guinness company changed, the legacy of the empire continued to live on through powerful symbols of buildings, traditions, and cultural icons that reminded the world of how a single brewery came to shape an entire nation's identity. The most enduring of these monuments stands where the story began: St. James's Gate Brewery in Dublin. When Arthur Guinness signed the 9,000-year lease in 1759, the property covered just 4 acres and housed a struggling brewery. Over the centuries that followed, it expanded into a vast industrial complex stretching across dozens of acres. Massive brewing vats, towering brick buildings, and networks of pipes transformed the site into one of the most recognizable brewing centers on earth. For generations of Dubliners, the brewery became more than a workplace. It was an institution. Thousands of workers found stable employment within its walls. Entire neighborhoods grew around the rhythms of the brewery's operations. The smell of roasted barley drifting through the air became a familiar part of Dublin life. By the late 20th century, however, Guinness realized that its history itself had become a powerful asset. In 2000, the company opened a Guinness Storehouse, a museum and visitor experience built inside a former fermentation plant at St. James's Gate. The structure was designed around a massive glass atrium shaped like a giant pint of Guinness. Rising through several floors, the building told the story of the brand. From the barley fields and brewing techniques to the global spread of the famous stout, visitors traveled from every corner of the world to see the place where the Guinness empire had been born. At the very top of the storehouse sits the Gravity Bar, offering a panoramic view of Dublin's skyline. There, guests raise a glass of Guinness while looking out across the city that helped shape the brand's identity. The experience blends history, culture, and marketing into a powerful reminder of how deeply the stout is connected to Irish heritage. Yet, the Guinness legacy extends far beyond one building. Another enduring symbol is the Guinness harp, the brand's famous logo. The harp has been associated with Ireland for centuries, representing the country's musical and cultural traditions. When the Guinness Company adopted the harp as its emblem in the 19th century, it created a powerful visual link between the stout and Irish identity. Interestingly, the symbol became so closely associated with Guinness that when the Irish government later adopted the harp as its national emblem, it had to reverse the orientation of the instrument to avoid copying the brewery's design. Few brands in history have achieved such a deep cultural connection. Across the world, Guinness advertising campaigns helped reinforce this image. During the 20th century, the company produced some of the most memorable advertisements ever created in the drinks industry. Posters featuring playful characters such as the famous Guinness toucan, balancing a pint of stout on its beak, became instantly recognizable. One of the most celebrated advertising slogans appeared in the 1930s. Guinness is good for you. Although originally used in a humorous marketing campaign, the phrase became part of popular culture, repeated in pubs and homes across Britain and Ireland for decades. Another campaign introduced the iconic phrase, "Good things come to those who wait." The slogan perfectly captured the brewing process behind Guinness Stout. The drink was known for its distinctive two-part pour, where the pint is filled slowly, allowed to settle, and then topped up to create the famous creamy head. The patience required to pour a proper Guinness became part of the ritual of drinking it. These traditions helped transform Guinness from a simple beverage into a global cultural symbol. But perhaps the most meaningful legacy of the Guinness empire lies not in advertising or architecture, but in philanthropy. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, members of the Guinness family used their wealth to support housing, education, and social reform. The Guinness Trust, founded in 1890 by Edward Cecil Guinness, built thousands of homes for working-class families in London and Dublin. These housing developments provided safer living conditions for people who might otherwise have faced extreme poverty. Schools, hospitals, and charitable foundations also benefited from the family asset contributions. In many ways, the Guinness dynasty believed that success carried an obligation to improve the society around them. This idea echoed a sentiment expressed by the Irish statesman Edmund Burke, whose words reflect the responsibility that often accompanies great wealth. The true measure of a man is how he treats those who can do him absolutely no good. Through philanthropy and public projects, the Guinness name became associated not only with brewing excellence, but also with civic responsibility. Today, millions of pints of Guinness are still poured every day across the globe, from Dublin to Lagos, from London to New York. The dark stout remains instantly recognizable. The brand has survived political change, industrial revolutions, corporate scandals, and the transformation of global markets. The Guinness empire may no longer be controlled by the family that created it, but the symbols they built continue to endure. The brewery, the harp, the traditions of the perfect pour, all stand as reminders of a remarkable story that began with one brewer's bold decision beside the River Liffey. And yet, even the greatest legacies carry a quiet truth. No empire remains exactly as it began. By the end of the 20th century, the Guinness empire had reached a moment that many great family dynasties eventually faced, the transition from family control to corporate legacy. The stout remained famous. The brand remained powerful, but the structure behind it had changed forever. For more than 2 centuries, the Guinness Brewery had grown under the guidance of the descendants of Arthur Guinness. Each generation inherited not only wealth, but also responsibility. They carried the expectation that the brewery would remain both successful and respectable, a symbol of Irish craftsmanship and disciplined business. But modern global markets were very different from the world Arthur Guinness had known. As the drinks industry became increasingly international, companies began merging into larger corporate groups capable of competing across continents. Breweries were no longer simply family businesses serving regional markets. They were now part of a complex network of multinational brands, investors, and financial institutions. The defining moment of this transformation came in 1997, when Guinness merged with Grand Metropolitan, creating the global beverage corporation Diageo. The merger was enormous in scale. Diageo quickly became one of the largest drinks companies in the world, controlling a vast portfolio that included whiskey, vodka, gin, rum, and beer. Within this massive organization, Guinness Stout remained one of the company's most valuable and recognizable products. Yet the merger confirmed a reality that had been gradually unfolding for decades. The Guinness dynasty no longer directed the empire it had built. The descendants of Arthur Guinness still existed as members of society, many involved in philanthropy, business, or public life. However, the brewery itself had become part of a corporate structure governed by professional executives and international shareholders, rather than family leadership. For some historians, this moment represented the quiet fading of the Guinness family's direct power. It was not a dramatic collapse. There was no sudden bankruptcy, no revolution, no destruction of the brewery itself. Instead, the dynasty simply transitioned into history while the brand it created continued operating on a global scale. This outcome reflects a pattern seen throughout many old money empires. Wealth and influence may survive for generations, but eventually economic systems evolve beyond the structures that first created them. In the case of Guinness, the brand proved remarkably adaptable. Even within the Daigou portfolio, Guinness remained a flagship symbol of heritage and quality. Marketing campaigns continued to celebrate its Irish roots, its distinctive brewing process, and its famous dark color crowned with a creamy head. Around the world, the ritual of pouring a pint of Guinness remained almost ceremonial. Bartenders carefully filled the glass, allowed the stout to settle, and topped it off to perfection. A process that reminded drinkers that this beverage carried centuries of tradition. Meanwhile, St. James's Gate Brewery in Dublin continued producing Guinness, as it had 4 generations. Although modern technology had improved efficiency, the essence of the brewing process remained rooted in the techniques refined during the 18th and 19th centuries. Visitors walking through the brewery grounds could still sense the weight of history. The buildings, the equipment, and the river nearby all whispered stories of ambition and persistence. Yet the Guinness story also reminds us of a deeper truth about power and legacy. A famous observation attributed to the philosopher Marcus Aurelius reflects this reality. Time is a sort of river of passing events, and strong is its current. Empires rise, adapt, and sometimes fade into different forms. The Guinness Empire followed this same path. The brewery that began with a determined brewer signing an astonishing lease had survived revolutions in industry, social and corporate scandals, and global expansion. Its founder's ambition had created a brand strong enough to endure even after the family that built it stepped away from control. Today, the Guinness name still stands among the most recognized brands in the world, but the dynasty that once ruled it has become part of history. Remembered not for a dramatic downfall, but for a transformation that quietly reshaped one of the most remarkable business empires ever created. The story of the Guinness Empire begins with a simple but extraordinary act of faith. In 1759, a brewer looked at a struggling building beside the River Liffey and imagined something far greater than what stood before him. With determination and a 9,000-year lease, Arthur Guinness planted the seeds of a legacy that would outlive him by centuries. From those early barrels of porter, an empire slowly emerged. Generation after generation expanded the vision. The brewery grew into the largest in the world. The Guinness family entered the ranks of the British aristocracy, and their stout traveled across oceans to become one of the most recognized drinks on the planet. Wealth, influence, and prestige followed. But history rarely allows power to exist without its cost. The success of the Guinness name created expectations that every generation struggled to carry. Social acceptance had to be fought for. Reputation had to be protected. And in the modern age of corporate competition, the Dynasty faced challenges that even its founder might never have imagined. The financial scandal of the 1980s revealed how fragile reputation can be, even after centuries of careful work. It marked the moment when the Guinness Empire shifted from family dynasty to global corporation. And yet, the story does not end with decline. The brewery still stands in Dublin. The stout is still poured in pubs around the world, and the Guinness hop remains one of the most recognizable symbols of Irish identity. The empire changed form, but its influence endured. Perhaps the real lesson of the Guinness story lies in a simple historical truth, often repeated through the centuries. A society grows great when people plant trees whose shade they know they shall never sit in. Arthur Guinness planted one such tree. What he built brought immense wealth, global fame, and centuries of influence. But the family that nurtured the empire could not hold on to every part of it forever. In the end, the Guinness legacy shows us something timeless about power. Great fortunes may shape the world, but time always shapes the fortunes.